Hello and welcome to Coffee with Maxwell. This episode is about a big topic, the global green coffee market. Now, I think anyone who has worked in coffee, whether in specialty or more commercial coffee, or as a consumer, I think this narrative, this consideration of a fair price or a sustainable price is one that has always been there since I got into coffee. And specialty coffee talks about addressing that potentially in its own way. But I think with the recent market jump, which means that for most of us who have been in coffee, I mean, I've been in coffee about 15 years, but really in the roastery 6 years old. So in terms of sourcing coffee and understanding pricing per country, per quality, etc., I've been doing it all like a lot of people in specialty coffee in a relatively stable and low market. And so with that as your regular benchmark, you build up a bunch of thoughts and a bunch of ideas about how the market works. Now, I just want to jump in here because I've been thinking about this, and the truth is, if you haven't deep dived into a subject and studied it at length yourself, generally your understanding of it is an understanding passed on to you by others. If we rely on this in most of life, we can't deep dive into everything, and especially in coffee. It's a pretty complex industry. And we hear it the first time and we go, oh, does that make sense to us? And that's how we, judge it. And then, of course, if we hear the same narrative multiple times, that naturally gives us a sense of assurance that it's a more accurate narrative. And before you know it, you subconsciously have developed this perceived understanding of how something works. And I'm guilty of this. You're telling someone else, oh, it works like this. And I think this area of the industry, there's a few in coffee, are particularly prone to this. And I think part of it is marketing as well, right? Which is, you want to say, okay, well, why is specialty good? And it's quite a crusade. The whole movement has got a crusade element to it a bit. Well, the coffee's better, the coffee is higher quality, it's more sustainable, more money goes to the farmer. And it's not just that specialty shouts about the benefits of what it does. It also does this other thing where it pits itself against the commercial industry and vilifies it. And so you create this strong separation of like virtuous, really good, all really bad. And it's just not accurate. There is a lot more nuance and complexity going on there. And in this video, I really just explore that because I think I myself had an oversimplified understanding of the way the market does and doesn't work and where specialty sits. And it's been really interesting learning more and more about it. And I don't cover, this is a big topic, it's not all covered in this video, even though it's very long. And so I won't forgive you if you don't finish it. And there's a lot more to learn there. And really this video is about that idea of sort of digging into the nuance and the context and really trying to think about something, whether our understanding of what the problem and the solution is are accurate or whether they can be improved. Now what we're living through is a spike in pricing. And I think very clearly, we'll touch on this, but it shows that specialty is not separate to the C market. Maybe you could argue 90 plus coffees are so far detached that even though there's a ripple effect there and they will be affected in some way depending on where the C price is, they are further away and therefore less impacted. But the closer you get, so those 80 to 85 point coffees, it's clear in the last several months for every specialty coffee roaster around the world, the C market is clearly 100% impactful on specialty. So I want to talk about the C market, what it is and what it isn't. And I also want to talk about this idea of sustainable pricing in coffee and what specialty does and doesn't do, but also what commercial does and doesn't do. Now, to state the obvious, but something which has only really come home to me researching this video, to be honest, in specialty what we really do, on the whole, bar a few interesting projects, is the whole movement is about rewarding quality with a premium. But this is important because we're not just paying more for coffee, we are paying more but asking for more. We're saying if we get that quality in the cup, that value, we'll pay more for it. Now obviously what underlines this idea is that that's worth doing for the producer. But it's not always the case. And I'd like to dig into that a little bit. And I'd like to dig into the comparisons that specialty make to commercial. So when you see a specialty roaster saying, we pay double the fair trade premium, that's a bit of an odd comparison, isn't it? Because that specialty roaster isn't going and buying the same coffee that gets the fair trade premium. And the same goes for the C price. Are you buying the kind of coffee that would have sold at the current benchmark coffee prices, the C prices, or no? And so nearly all the time, the amount more paid by a specialty roaster is effectively the market value for boutique premium coffee. It's not a contribution on top of somebody who was going to make the C price anyway. This part of the video is going to be a little exploration of what the C market is. So the C market represents the global commodities market for coffee. It's all traded in the US dollar against a pound of coffee in terms of weight. And really it's a global average of value for most of the coffee grown. It's important here to reiterate that the C is not a base price. It is not the bottom of the barrel. And I see in quite a few articles that the C is referred to as a base price. It isn't. It is a benchmark for average value in a global coffee market against the global supply. It doesn't, it's a market and you can sell coffee to the market as a producer through something called ICE, and it is based around sort of washed, milds and certified coffees. So the market itself isn't trading in all coffees. Obviously, boutique specialty coffee doesn't get traded through that market, but nevertheless, it behaves and acts as a benchmark for the pricing of all coffee. So even if you're not selling to the market, you are selling with the commodities market, the C price, as a benchmark for pricing, for value of coffee. And then you have a differential, and so it means that people are willing to pay a little bit more or less per country for the same quality. I mean, Brazil is very famous for the fact that you can sell below the C price, and that's because Brazil is the most efficient coffee growing country in the world. It's also almost 50% of all Arabica grown, and so it can set often the most efficient price for growing a given quality of coffee, and then the other countries effectively cost more, and that costs more to grow similar qualities of coffee, and also they often bring something else to the table. So they may have a characteristic that you couldn't get from those coffees in Brazil. So the differential bears that in mind, and you would say, okay, for a given quality coffee in Colombia, it will be a plus differential on the C market. But it could also go the other way, and you could say, okay, here's a lower grade coffee, and it would be a minus differential. Or aged coffee that was harvested over a year ago that sat in a warehouse somewhere, may be sold at a minus differential to the C. And so to try and keep it simple, the C market is really just a benchmark price for coffee value, and it goes up or down, and depending on the coffee you're growing and who you're selling it to, you'll negotiate around that C price. Now the C price naturally has a bad rep within specialty, because a global commodities price will effectively favour larger, at-scale commercial coffee growing, no different to any other industry, right? So, you could kind of say that Brazil becoming, again, they've got the land, they've got enough altitude, but still relatively flat, and they've been able to mechanize and innovate and constantly get more efficient at producing coffee at scale. And you could say China did the same thing with mass consumer manufacturing of the kind of consumer goods at those lower price points. It's a bit like playing golf with a handicap, right? So if Brazil are the pros and you've got your handicap because you're not as competitive against them, the handicap helps. But the C market doesn't really have a handicap. It has the differentials, but that's based on value, like actual value of what people are willing to pay in that country. And this is the problem with any kind of big market like this, which is you've got all these different countries around the world in different economic, geopolitical, macroeconomic situations, and some will be more competitive, in a better position to compete on that global market than others. And then not even country to country, even within a country, then you go down to size of business. Again, it would be the same here in the UK. So I am a relatively small roastery, so I am at a competitive disadvantage to the large established roasteries who have been able to invest in all the equipment, the technology, they have access to debt more than I do. All these reasons, which means they should be able to roast a bag of coffee cheaper than I should, and that's sustainable for them. Obviously, what I rely on, and other boutique roasteries, is that we have some kind of USP to separate us, which is why we can charge more. And it would be the same for coffee producers. So, as a small holder, you are going to be the most disadvantaged competitively, right? And of course, it's agriculture. So you have the specific land, the specific yields, how easy it is to grow coffee where you are. There's going to be the investment of fertilizer and everything else. So again, I'm sure just like when I buy paper bags or cardboard from a supplier, I'm not going to get as good a price as the huge roastery that buys high volume. And so most markets will benefit scale. Of course, the other option is you focus on boutique and high end. And so if you look at when the market's been low for the last 10 years, it's natural that if, as a small holder or a cooperative or a smaller farm, if you're less competitive than the big guys at scale, then it's very logical that you would focus on quality. And I think that's really what's come out of this, which is, talking to lots of different people who work in this space, without going off on how you feel about sort of completely unchecked capitalism versus regulation, and whether you think that free markets are bad. Coffee's a pretty free market. In its history, like you had the ICO, the International Coffee Organization, which had the ICA, the International Coffee Agreement, where there was effectively a regulation against coffee pricing for some time, which there now isn't. Of course, very few markets are completely free. In the UK, there's a minimum wage, there are regulations and there are subsidies for smaller businesses, and so there is funding and regulation which is impacting that free market. And so personally, that's the combination I'm in favour of, is a relatively free market with an appropriate amount of regulation. Regulation isn't always as clear cut as you think it might be, but there are clearly some pros. I think this people I've been speaking to who work in specialty, who they love specialty, they've been in it for a while, and they've really focused on trading and studying the market. And one of them even said to me, don't tell people in specialty I said this, but I think the C market is good, and it is there's lots of elements about the futures, the effectively that you can sell coffee that you haven't grown yet, ice, and mechanisms of the market which are positive for coffee producers, right? And of course, there's negatives to it, but what is the different system, right? And I was reading a few articles as I came to start film this video, and you can't fix a market really. Unless you're going to come up with some new world order that no human being has really figured out yet. So, now those free markets, there are global free markets for many, many different things. But why is that concern more significant in coffee? Well, you can't talk about the global coffee market without talking about the position and the development of different economies and different nations and territories. And you can't talk about that without talking about the history of colonialism and the relationships between historically in coffee producing and consuming countries. It's quite different, I think, to talk about a very strong economy losing, homegrown, onshore manufacturing, because for example, in the UK, we've become less competitive on a global scale at producing those products. It's quite different to talk about that than it is to talk about a low market in coffee in a lot of the other coffee producing countries beyond Brazil. Because it's about where those market movements leave individuals, communities, when that market goes low. And so it's about social and economic mobility. So being able to find a different job or change what you're doing because the market's too low and it's not worth growing coffee anymore. And you do hear that this is cited in a lot of research, that this is happening in coffee. People are going to cities to get jobs, and people are considering not growing coffee. But then you look at the global supply of coffee and you wonder if that can be happening on any scale, because the supply still seems to be there. And the forecasts I've seen suggest that unless there continues to be frosts in Brazil or climate change driven phenomena, then it will continue to stay pretty high, right? And so the point is that if you're in a rural location in particular, people talk about rural smallholders, you don't have access to a lot of opportunity. So when the market, and if you're relying on coffee and the market goes below the cost of your production, not the production elsewhere in the world, but that C price for you wherever you are, especially when you're smaller, your cost of production will be worse. You won't be as efficient as a at-scale farmer or a farmer in a country that is more mechanized, right? You're now below the cost of production, and can you quickly pivot to something else or find an income somewhere else? And in a lot of the circumstances and situations where people are saying this is a problem, we're concerned about this, is because the answer is no, it's not that easy to do that. And then there's plenty of examples of generational debt off the back of trying to keep that moving when the market's low, and then carrying that debt and becoming more and more economically disadvantaged, right? And as with most things in coffee, the particular circumstance you're discussing will be very specific to which producing country you're talking about. And in reality, you're going a lot further than that. You're talking about a specific region within the country you're talking about. Again, just like we'd be talking about the UK and be talking about, okay, well, London is more economically developed, and concerns about Cornwall or the north of England or Northern Ireland, and then more subsidies and support going there. So let's come back to specialty and what specialty talks about and is trying to do. Like I said at the beginning, specialty really is about rewarding quality, and I think the reality is that as a movement, what specialty has done extremely well is championed and grown the opportunity to sell higher quality coffee. All the way through, that means there is a premium around character and quality and scarcity. That's really important, scarcity one. As soon as you make something less scarce, it's going to lose value, even for specialty, right? This idea that all coffee could become specialty, it would just become the C price. That's what would happen, right? But that's also like a strange thought experiment, because quite rightly people reach out to me and say, hey Max, it's really interesting, we were chatting about flavored coffee, and they were saying, look, we can't grow those high scoring coffee just based on terroir, so focusing on trying to add value through processing is valuable to us, right? And that's really, I guess, the thing that specialty has to be realistic about, is its ultimate impact. We are the boutique premium sector, and there's loads of great examples of where that's benefited a producer, like 100% there is. For example, there's a producer whose coffee is getting sold to the local mill, and they're growing some really great coffee at 86, 87 that they could sell for higher, but they're just selling it in, maybe they need to separate it out from some of the other coffee they grow, or they're just getting less value because it's being sold as just a lower value coffee, right? So then specialty coffee's been quite good at creating that basically sales network, right? The whole community is kind of like a big conference center with a bunch of people finding each other. So I've got something you want, and I'd like to buy it. I will pay more for that. It tastes great, and and those connections between basically roasters and consumers and producers. And so by increasing the interest in and the demand for great coffee, we're maximizing the sales opportunity. So there's now an opportunity, potentially, if you can grow the coffee to taste that good, and you can do it without it costing you too much money. Come on to that in just a sec. There's a great opportunity there. And even though I said earlier, we're seeing that the C market is directly influencing specialty, historically you would say a specialty premium is a more stable price than just trading the C, which can, is very, very spiky. And the further up you get on the scoring and the value and the scarcity, the more and more stable your pricing can be. So that's great, but what is the size of that impact? How big really is the market for specialty coffee? It's small, and there's a huge market out there which represents most of the people growing coffee around the world that wouldn't be part of that specialty dynamic. And so that means that coffee grown either commercially or at scale, specialty often describes it as like a dirty word, and that it just must all be bad. And of course I'm excited by coffee that tastes amazing, so of course I'm like, yeah, I'm interested in that, thanks. But from an economic point of view, there's clearly value. There's clearly coffee grown at scale efficiently that a lot of people make their livelihood from. It was interesting because I was at Cafe Culture at the back end of last year, and there was a Brazilian producer, Mio Coffee, who I think that's what they're called, and they have an office in London now, so they manage the export and import into the UK and Europe themselves. And they were talking about this trade-off, this quid pro quo between score and cost. So most of the time, well, all of the time, it is inherently more expensive to make great coffee than it is less great coffee, right? And a lot of the time that's could be to do with the resources required throughout the year, but it's also to do with sorting. So it's to do with picking, sorting, processing, sorting again. And she was basically saying that they can sort a lot of their 79-point coffee to get to 82. And a lot of that means waste and resource. And that at 82, they were losing money. So they're better off selling coffee at 79. Now you see this in lots of businesses. Your most expensive product doesn't necessarily make you the most money. And I think, when you've run a few businesses or been involved in them, it's really fascinating to see. But there's obviously that volume piece there as well. If you have a big farm, what's more important to you is cash margin than percentage margin, i.e. you could sell a small micro lot at a high percentage margin, but if it's 50 kilos, 100 kilos, how much did you really make? And actually what's paying the wages and supporting the sustainability of the farm would be more volume, right? It's the same. I mean, we're a pretty boutique roastery and we sell a lot of high scoring coffees, but like the really expensive Gesher or Yemeni auction lot isn't paying people's salaries, right? And so really what you're trying to find is that optimal where you've got enough scale and enough quality, and you're sort of going up and down on that all the time. Obviously it depends on what you're trying to achieve as a business, of course, and where you're trying to sit in the marketplace. Now, somebody who trades coffee said to me, well, the reason they can't produce coffee that's valuable at 82 is they must be doing something wrong. Because if loads of other people around the world are selling coffee at 82 and making money with it, it shows it can be done. And I think they kind of have a point, but I want to come back to the resource thing. That's like me in the UK saying, well, I can't, it's not profitable for me to sell coffee at the same price as some of the larger roasters. And the same argument would be, well, you just need to figure out how to do it better, because if they're doing it, you can do it. And it's like, well, yeah, they've got a lot more resource and technology than me. So I look at specialty roasters all the time, and I'm like, you've got a small roaster, you're doing ham roasting, ham packing, all that costs more, and it puts you at a competitive disadvantage. I mean, the irony that a lot of specialty roasters are selling coffee at a higher price per unit, but actually are less profitable than a company who's selling less boutique, less high-priced coffee that's fascinating, right? It just proves that a higher price doesn't simply mean a bunch more profits going through. In fact, someone emailed our aftercare, Pete at the roastery does aftercare, and they just don't understand how our capsules can be so expensive and we must be price gouging. And I'm halfway through drafting this long email of what it actually costs to do all this stuff. Now, of course, there'll be examples. I was reading some of Raw Materials' work where they identify communities with low cost, simple intervention can increase the cut profile. So that's the goal. It's like going, okay, how can we just tweak a few things and push up the cut score 2-3 points? And then that really is just more, profitable. That's the dream, that's what you want to do. But the reason I wanted to give that Brazil example is that's not always the case, right? And to simply say, well, focus on quality and that'll sort out your business or make it more sustainable is sadly not always the truth or the answer to running a business in any industry. Often I find myself choosing to do quality at the cost of profit. Of course, there's the resource one as well here, right? So it's quite often pointed out that producers that can really push the boundaries of experimentation, processing, cultivars, variety gardens. I mean, I've been to visit a few. These are well-resourced, relatively wealthy operations. So how would I sum up the specialty impact? Well, I would say, yes, it's amazing that we champion quality and promote the opportunity to develop a sustainable business around quality, but that it's not a given, that you don't just have you're not just a sustainable coffee farmer by producing higher quality coffee. And again, really, this is all the same stuff we have to learn if we're running a cafe or a roastery. It's the same at every level. You need to run a business and figure out how to run that business. And it's clear that the real challenge of the C market is, it's a competitive marketplace globally. And actually, there's going to be business models that are more competitive. So a single smallholder with a hectare is in a disadvantaged position. They come together as a cooperative, they're in a stronger position. If they can co-own the mill or come together in some collaboration or community setup, that's a much stronger position. And of course you see per country, like Colombia is pretty famous for this, which is saying, is that the FNC and Colombian coffee market has done a good job at promoting itself, but also, the FNC developing a focus on washed cachuras in Colombia's of a high quality, because there is always a market there. And so you can't really discuss the different challenges per country predominantly without thinking about the organisations or the governments working in those countries. And I was listening to a podcast the other day, it's called Food Music, and this woman from Rwanda who became fascinated with coffee, a local coffee shop in Rwanda with latte art, and then got fascinated by the whole thing and is an ambassador for Rwandan coffee and talking about the value of Rwandan coffee. And I've had a few farmers or people from certain countries talk about trying to raise the profile of your origin on the global market as a brand. Colombia's, you see in UK supermarkets, like consumers, there's certain origins that they know and associate with quality, right? So even though the Colombian prices are super high right now, if customers still want Colombian coffee and won't just switch to something else which isn't as expensive, well, they still want the Colombian coffee, right? So that stickiness, we talk about that in business all the time, is important. This idea of a premium around quality isn't going to be the solution for the majority of the world's coffee producers. And right now, the high C market is actually having a much bigger positive impact than some specialty premiums on the whole, right? Of course, the worry is that the price will go back down. And then that's why I was explaining some of these per country initiatives that would have more impact. How does the coffee growing organizations in a given country help farmers and producers to be competitive on a global scale? And that really is where the ultimate solution will come from, because being competitive in a marketplace means you're less exposed. There are some great projects out there doing this independently, right? You know, you've got TechnoServe, it's pretty amazing, and operated throughout Ethiopia. You look maybe some of the most interesting projects are like the initiatives of Nespresso. Now, obviously Nespresso is owned by Nestle, and Nestle buys a lot of commercial coffee, right? But Nespresso is not only buying specialty scoring coffees, but it is also doing probably more than any company buying specialty could say it's doing, right? I personally work on a project in Mozambique where they have put processing experts on the ground, invested in technology, cultivars, education, and they're doing it all with no contract. They're not saying, oh, we'll come and do all this investment for you to, and then you have to give us your coffee. They have a policy to support either new or reviving origins and to help them to achieve a higher quality coffee and be more competitive in the market. Now, if you think about it, it makes sense for Nespresso to do that. They would need the supply of great coffee, so they're thinking, how can we encourage and reward higher scoring coffee? You look at the goals of raw materials as a boutique working in country exporter, and you know, individual coffee companies and some big coffee companies, you know, like this is what was amazing for me about researching transparency and certifications in coffee, which is again and again, I came back to the Cafe Practices program by Starbucks, which people said, yep, probably the best program, it's brilliant. And someone made a staggering, posed a staggering question that stayed with me, which was, if every independent coffee shop in the UK shut down tomorrow and they were replaced with a Starbucks, overall, producers of coffee would be better off. I mean, that's a big, just think about that question for a minute. And I guess the reason I want to put that one out there is specialty is very good at being often, you know, when I group everyone together, very sort of virtuous and pious, and that, you know, we're fixing everything and this is the only way to do it. And the reality is we can focus on our small sector and we can grow it and we can improve, and we should be proud of what we're doing. But we should also recognize that companies working at scale can have a big impact, and probably more impact than we can too. So this high C price, you know, it's fascinating. What does it mean? So it means right now, you know, most farmers around the world are better off. Obviously the producers in Brazil who were hit, you know, who represented that 20% loss, that's huge, especially considering how many bags of coffee Brazil produces. They were less well off, of course, and you don't get any move up in a market without somebody missing out. Oh, and just before I talk about this high market, there's one really important thing to consider, which was a big learning for me when we talk about global coffee pricing. As important as the C market itself is the strength of the dollar to the local currency. It's really important, this one, and I just had never thought about this. Obviously, I notice being in the UK, when I'm buying green coffee, the strength of the pound to the dollar impacts me as a roastery, right? But either the peso in Colombia or the real in Brazil, if they are weak, yeah, and these are volatile currencies, even though the dollar, the C market's gone down, farmers could still be better off than when the market was higher. It sounds crazy, right? But, you know, there was an example that a particular importer was taking me through, where because of the devaluation of the local currency, even though the C market, even with the C market lower, that dollar is worth more internally, right? So you can't really understand the cost of production or whether the C market is below the cost of production in any given country without also understanding the relationship between that local currency at that moment in time. So let's come back to this high C price. So what does it mean? Well, you know, I think all of us who have sort of tried to figure out, you know, a lot of us who are drawn to specialty coffee, you know, the idea that farmers could make more and a sustainable livelihood is something that we're passionate about and trying to get our heads around. So what does this higher C price mean for specialty? Well, this is a really interesting question, right? We've spent so long with a lower C market and specialty differentiating itself, and suddenly that C market, almost overnight, has sort of run into specialty, and actually some of the premiums or the prices being paid a year, 2 years ago are below what the C price is now, right? And of course, everything shifts up. Again, I don't think the really high coffees will shift up relative. They won't have a 100% increase. But it's very, very interesting because you have to say, well, look, this is good. A higher price is going to benefit a lot of people as a base price. But it also creates an interesting question for specialty, which is, will specialty roasteries or businesses pass on that increase to their consumers? And I think the answer is, well, no. And of course, a lot of people are saying, well, the high should only last a couple of years and then it will come back down. In fact, I have a bet with a couple of importers on a very nice bottle of whiskey that by 2027, so 5 years, that they're betting the price is going to go back down all the way under $1. Now, the odds aren't with me, or the historical evidence isn't with me, but I'm betting it will stay above. I have a few sort of reasons to why I think that's the case. The most short-term indicator of what the market's going to do is going to be in the summer, UK summer, and the reports coming out of Brazil about what the crop looks like. And if they're not good reports, then the market could go over $3. Right now, it's about just over $2.30. But I think there's other reasons, right? Which is, again, I appreciate the local currency, but at some point, the market's just been coming down and down and down. And when you adjust for inflation, it's definitely come down. It keeps coming down to this dollar mark. And at some point, it won't be able to anymore. And so I'm betting it will stay above the dollar. But let's see. But then the question for the specialty coffee businesses are, if the market does stay high, and to be fair, none of the predictions suggest that the market will really come down for a couple of years. Well, then it's like, what do? Do you pass all of that on? And I think this is a challenge that specialty's always had. And actually a higher C market, which is better overall for producers, really pushes specialty on its dilemma or its challenge, which is, how does it, as a movement, pay enough to reward quality? And of course, there needs to be a value proposition with customers. This is all linked, of course. If I talk to people in Australia who say the price of a flat white hasn't gone up in a decade, and let's be real, like people say, oh, you can just put the prices up, and it's like, well, everyone who's run a business can see that your higher priced products sell less. So as you push the prices up and up and up, the amount of sales tends to go down. And so depending on where you sit in the market, you're finding you're optimal. But I guess what I'm saying here is, do I think roasteries will pass on that full amount? Some might, I think. But on the whole, I would imagine that 3 things are going to happen. I think there will be an increase. You're already seeing it happening. B2B clients, there's a relationship there where there's some margin being passed on. But let's not forget, it's not just coffee that's increasing the cost of roasted coffee in somewhere like the UK. It's the cost of cardboard, it's the cost of transport, it's the cost of nitrogen and resources and everything, right? But I also think what will happen, and this is, the cynical side of me, is I think the quality of coffee will go down in the bag. I think, of course, businesses won't just suddenly go, but like a point or two, right? Or maybe, in some cases it won't even be the drop in quality, it will be a change in traceability. So it will be going from selling a single farm lot to selling a cooperative lot. Similar quality, but somewhere they are trying to reduce some cost. There's a really interesting example here, which is a higher C, if it stays high, would actually reduce quality, which kind of goes against that sort of narrative that, quality is the solution. Well, the solution is just a better price for coffee, which means there's less incentive actually for quality. I mean, one of the examples right now in Colombia, quite a few people are saying, look, the price is really high in Colombia. And before we were working with producers and asking them to do all this work to deliver a high quality picked, sort of grown, picked, harvested, processed coffee. And now they're just selling, it's better for them just to sell the cherry. They're making enough from that. And what that suggests is the premium can't have been that high for specialty, can it? Like, we must have been asking for a lot of work, because if the work was only a little bit more work and the premium was high, you wouldn't be incentivized to do that. But I just think it's a really, really interesting example. And it means that the dilemma specialty has really is it has to rethink, okay, what do we need to do to deliver quality? And because that really is what we're promising customers. The third one, because let's just reiterate, the first is, I think, a slight increase in price, but not enough to cover the actual increases that have occurred. The second one will be roasters attempting to reduce the cost in their raw ingredients. And I've already heard this from importers. They say, look, they're getting phoned up more than ever and saying, you know, what have we got at this price point? So that's happening. And then the third one is lower margin, lower profit for the roastery. And that's interesting because if we go back to my race to the bottom video, it's already a pretty tight market, right? You know, I was chatting to a friend of mine who runs got 3 or 4 coffee shops, and he was saying, you know, these roasters, a lot of them are losing money already. If you look at the books, there's a lot of roasteries in the UK, either VC backed or heavily funded, that are losing money already. And so I do think it'll be interesting to watch this play out over the next couple of years. And I guess as a coffee customer, a consumer, you've really got to ask yourself, like, you know, that would be your question, you know, is the quality in the bag what you say it is? In one way, that's one of the key lessons from this exploration of the market, which is specialty's promise to its consumer. Really, the one it has the strongest claim to is quality. And as soon as it's not delivering that, well, it's really not achieving anything it set out to achieve anymore. So I'm going to round this video up now. Hopefully I've stimulated some thoughts or some questions or some conversation. I'm personally fascinated by the whole market dynamic and how coffee works. And, you know, there's definitely progression and improvement that we can have. But I do firmly believe, like I talked about at the beginning of the video, that to properly identify the problems and to identify the areas for improvement or solutions, you have to really understand what's going on. And I hope to learn a lot more about the market, especially per country, because that's become clear to me, is that you need to understand the specific context per country. And I really hope that I have questioned some of those overly simplistic, sort of virtuous narratives that, you know, aren't accurate. And there is a lot of nuance and complexity here, and I appreciate that can be frustrating. And I also appreciate that, you know, when you start to dig into a topic like this, the complexity of it can be overwhelming. But I think the best that each of us can do is to learn more about the thing that we're involved in, to always want to learn more about it, to always improve our understanding, and of course focus on areas of realistic practical impact that we can have, but that also we need to be open-minded, challenge our preconceptions and our cognitive biases, and respect and appreciate other forms of impact outside of specialty as well.